I'd say the lesson I learned from it is when you shouldn't be making a record, don't make a record. We sort of let Morning Glory land after Knebworth, and that American tour that came just after Knebworth that ended in a disaster and ruined us.
Picture this, it's August 21st, 1997. Across the UK, record stores are throwing their doors open at midnight. News cameras are rolling, capturing massive lines of fans, some of who have been camping out for days, finally getting their hands on the most hyped album of the decade. On its first day, it sells a mind-blowing 424,000 copies. By the end of the week, it's at nearly 700,000, making it the fastest-selling album in British history, a record it would hold for 18 long years. The band, Oasis. The album, Be Here Now. This was supposed to be their masterpiece, the crowning achievement for the biggest band on the planet. And yet, years later, the man who wrote every single note would talk about it with pure, uncut disgust. So how does that happen? How does an album that topped the charts in 15 different countries and practically defined a moment in time become a punchline? How did Britpop's victory lap turn into a bloated, overstuffed monument to excess that the band itself and a whole lot of their fans and critics would learn to hate? This is the story of the ego, the drugs, and the deep regret behind Be Here Now. Before we get started, be sure to hit the bell notification icon and put all notifications on. I hear from a lot of my subscribers that they don't even get notifications when I post my videos. I would greatly appreciate if you guys did that. To really get the glorious, catastrophic mess of Be Here Now, you have to understand what the world looked like in 1996. Oasis wasn't just a band, they were a force of nature. Their 1994 debut, Definitely Maybe, was a shot of raw aspirational adrenaline that became the fastest selling debut in UK history. But it was the follow-up 1995 What's the Story Morning Glory that made them global superstars. The album had anthems so huge, so woven into the fabric of the 90s, it felt less like a record and more like a national soundtrack. Roy Wilkinson of Select Magazine recalled hearing a pub full of pensioners sing along to Wonderwall when it came on the jukebox, adding, "It seemed like an every person record." You're my Britpop was at its absolute peak, part of a cultural moment of renewed British pride called Cool Britannia. Their swagger was contagious, their interviews were legendary, and their songs were, well, everywhere. This all hit a climax in August of '96. Over 2 nights, Oasis played to 250,000 people at Knebworth Park. But here's the crazy part of the story. 2.5 million people, 4% of the entire British population, had applied for tickets. It was the biggest demand for a concert in UK history. It felt like they were literally standing on top of the world. But when you're at the summit, the only way to go is, well, down. As their manager Marcus Russell later admitted, the smart move would have been to just take a year off. But instead, the band were exhausted, burnt out, and the relationships were already falling apart. Liam even ditched the band mid-tour, as did Noel. Soon enough, Oasis was making the news, but not for their music, but rather their antics. Noel left the band during the tour for their second album, feeling like the band was too burnt out, having been on the road for 3 straight years. He told the LA Times, "The more we tour, the more we party. It got to the point where we'd be drunk every day." Instead of taking a long-deserved break, the band decided to do something else. To do the impossible. Make an album that was even bigger than Morning Glory. They felt like if they stopped working, the whole thing might just collapse. The pressure was insane. The anticipation was at a fever pitch. And as they walked into the legendary Abbey Road studios to start recording, they had the weight of the world on their shoulders. And as what the band members admitted themselves, absolutely no quality control whatsoever. The recording sessions for Be Here Now were, by all accounts, a total disaster, fueled by 2 main ingredients, ego and cocaine. The band that had once bonded over dreaming of getting out of working-class Manchester were now basically a medieval court. They'd pushed out their old friends who knew them before the fame and replaced them with an entourage of yes-men who only enabled their worst impulses. Noel admitted that critical feedback around the band was really no longer a thing, revealing, "I'd be writing songs in the back of a taxi on the way to the studio, but people would be telling me it was the best thing I'd ever written. Really? Okay, what are you going to do?" Noel, who is the band's songwriter and creative force, was at the peak of his fame, and as he'd later admit, his arrogance. When asked by New Musical Express in 1997 about whether Oasis, much like the Beatles, were bigger than God, he remarked, "I would have to say that without a shadow of a doubt that is true." Now, this did cause some controversy. There was a reverend named John Lomas who was interviewed by a local paper about the comments, and he replied, "The best-selling book ever is the Bible. So if Noel Gallagher's records are still selling and people are still talking about him in 2,000 years, then he can have a say." Now, this wasn't the only controversy the band found themselves in. Noel had given another interview where he said drug use was as normal as having a cup of tea. He did, however, walk back those comments, claiming that people should do research themselves and shouldn't start doing drugs in the first place. Noel, for his part, thought he was infallible, that every single idea he had was pure gold. The problem was he was starting to run out of ideas. The anthems that used to just pour out of him were now a struggle. He admitted to Rock Seller magazine, "To write those songs on the first two albums, you have to be that person in that life. I wasn't that person living that life anymore." His solution, though, was simple: make everything louder and more colossal. When asked about the tension regarding the creative process in the studio with his brother, Noel told the Boston Globe, "There is no creative tension because I create all the songs. I just give it to him and he sings it. If there's clashes, it's because he's got a pretty big mouth and I haven't. He's usually always wrong. I'm always usually right." So it, of course, was only fitting that on Be Here Now there was a song called My Big Mouth. The whole band, along with their producer Owen Morris, was drowning in drugs. Noel has been pretty brutally honest about this period, saying Be Here Now was the best advertisement against taking drugs. Producer Owen Morris even said the first week of recording was, as he put it, awful, and he even suggested they just scrap the whole thing. Noel, for his part, just shrugged and said, "It'll be all right." Morris later admitted he just gave up and resigned himself to simply doing more drugs. The band was also splintering in the studio. Richard Bowes, who wrote the book Some Might Say, talked about the band fragmenting, revealing, "I think the songs on Be Here Now are great. The circumstances surrounding them wasn't great. Be Here Now was the continuation of more of the same but less good. It was at that point that Liam was doing the vocals after everything else had been recorded. Noel was leaving the studio and then Liam was coming in the studio, so it became a lot more fragmented." According to the New York Times, both the Gallagher brothers even got married around this time, and they didn't even bother inviting each other to their own weddings. Noel responded to this, telling the Times, "I would have bought him a car or something had he invited me." But the whole recording process was a circus. The first sessions at Abbey Road were tense and useless. The band wanted to work all night, but the studio had a professional schedule, and they reportedly got kicked out after hiring a massive PA system and blasting the music so loud it disturbed a classical music session down the hall. To get away from the paparazzi, they moved to a secluded studio in the countryside, but the new location didn't stop the excess. It was still a chaotic, messy process that was setting them up for a very hollow victory. This creative free-for-all soon turned into a sonic arms race. The goal was to make the album sound as massive as humanly possible. In practice, this meant layering dozens and dozens of guitar tracks on every single song. The result, though, wasn't some rich, detailed tapestry of sound. It was an impenetrable, compressed wall of noise. The rhythm section, the very foundation of their early sound, was completely buried. You can barely even hear the bass in the final mix. Listening to the album today, especially on headphones, it's a 71-minute sonic assault. The song My Big Mouth reportedly featured 30 tracks in the mix. Actor Johnny Depp contributed slide guitar to one of the album's tracks, Fading Out. The songs themselves just seemed to buckle under all the weight. Tracks that Noel had written years earlier, like the sprawling All Around the World, were finally let loose in all their indulgent glory. The song, which he'd actually written before the band even had a record deal, ended up being over 9 minutes long with multiple key changes and a full-on orchestra. The lead single, Do You Know What I Mean, clocks in at nearly 8 minutes, and the lyrics were often written on the spot, just grand-sounding phrases strung together, a classic sign of a songwriter possibly running on empty. Noel told Q Magazine, "I was sitting there out of it, strung out, going, they'll play all 8 minutes of it. They'll play all 3 guitar solos. Of course they will, because it's got my name on it, and I rule the fucking world." And of course they didn't. The head of their record label felt that the best songs never actually made the album, admitting, "I wish I had made them save the B-sides, but we all thought the Purple Patch would go on forever." Be Here Now was also the last Oasis album to feature the classic lineup of Liam and Noel Gallagher, guitarist Paul Bonehead Arthurs, bassist Paul Gwigsy McGuigan, and Alan White on drums. The cover art for Oasis's Be Here Now is a striking, surreal, and quintessentially British tableau shot by renowned photographer Michael Spencer Jones at Stock's house in Hertfordshire. The original idea for the cover art was to have the members shot in a different city around the world, but that proved to be cost prohibitive. The image features the band members standing by a swimming pool, surrounded by an eclectic mix of props. At the center of the scene, a white 1972 Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow is shown partially submerged in the pool, which was a visual nod to the rock and roll excess and a direct homage to Keith Moon's legendary car and pool incident. Overall, the artwork blends grandeur, chaos, and humor, reflecting both Oasis's monumental fame and their larger-than-life attitude during the height of their career. So the band had created a monster, but the world was absolutely dying to hear it. The story of its release and what happened right after is just as wild as how it was made. But before we get into that, if you guys are enjoying the deep dive into music history, make sure you hit the subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next upload. The hype campaign for Be Here Now was on another level. The band's label, Creation Records, went to insane lengths to control the story and prevent leaks. They forced journalists to sign gag orders and barely allowed any pre-release radio play. BBC Radio 1 host Steve Lamacq was allowed to play a few tracks, but only if he talked over them to stop people from making illegal bootlegs. Of course, all the secrecy only made the public wanted more, and it also bred resentment by those who worked in the industry. Marcus Russell, who worked for the band's management company, Ignition, told The Guardian it was ludicrously self-important and it was only going to breed resentment. I don't think it was the right way to go about it. When the album finally dropped on Thursday, August 21st, 1997, it wasn't just a record release, it was a national event. The commercial success was immediate and historic. It sold over 424,000 copies on day one in the UK. It hit number one in 15 countries and became the best-selling album of 1997 in the UK.
Now, thousands of pop fans are glued to their CD players with the latest Oasis album today after queuing for the record's release. It went on sale simultaneously at shops throughout the country this morning.
For Oasis fans, an early start as they took the first opportunity to get their hands on the new album. There has been some limited airplay on radio stations this week, but as the new tracks blasted out in record shops nationwide, for many it was their first taste of what's being hailed the Gallagher's best to date.
They've got so much time for their fans and everything, and I love the music. Love them.
I work just up there. They're offering free breakfast, listen to the album, then buy it.
It's a special thing to be first in the queue with such an important album.
The first single from the album went straight to number one, and there's no doubt Be Here Now will follow suit. Music stores have already reported record pre-sale order. Noel and Liam have escaped the hype. They're both abroad on holiday, but still making the headlines. Noel Gallagher says if this doesn't become the greatest album of 1997, then the band might as well give up and go back on the dole. The tills continue to ring as they've been doing this morning. That's highly unlikely. Helen Walton, Sky News, Central London.
Globally, it sold around 8 million copies, and Oasis had done it. They delivered the blockbuster everyone was waiting for. It ended up being the band's final platinum record in the States. The first wave of reviews was overwhelmingly positive. A lot of critics, probably afraid of being on the wrong side of history, after some had been lukewarm to their first and second record, just heaped praise on it. The publications wanted to keep the most bankable stars on their side. Taylor Parks of Melody Maker revealed that his initial mixed review was actually edited to remove its harshest critiques. Q Magazine, meanwhile, a huge British music publication, gave it a 5-star review, while Mojo Magazine called it, and I quote, Oasis's world domination album. For a short, shining moment, it looked like Oasis had pulled off the impossible and could do no wrong. But then people actually listened to it. Once the hype wore off, critics and fans alike highlighted the album's flaws and shortcomings. The songs were way too long, the production was a muddy, overcompressed disaster, and for some it was just exhausting and weirdly joyless to listen to. Some critics felt like the band had also sacrificed their melodic flair for harder musical textures. Noel, though, answered back, adding that he wanted to break away from the melodic pop rock sound that led to scores of bands, as he put it, trying to sound like Oasis, trying to sound like the Beatles. Within 2 weeks, sales dropped off a cliff, and by 1999, Be Here Now had earned a pretty humiliating reputation. It was reportedly the most sold-back album to secondhand record stores in the UK. The public had spoken. The masterpiece was a dud. The cultural moment was now over. Britpop, the movement that Oasis had come to define, was effectively dead. Having collapsed under the weight of its own bloat, the party was over. The buzz around Be Here Now faded almost as quickly as it arrived. Its glory short-lived and its decline swift. However, the album's downfall wasn't solely due to its music. Oasis's peak of fame happened alongside major cultural shifts in the UK, such as the rise of New Labour, the excitement of Euro '96, and the Britpop movement, which all contributed to a sense of national optimism. By the time Be Here Now was released, the wave of positivity was already ebbing away. The initial enthusiasm following Labour's electoral win had dimmed, and just over a week after the album's release, the death of Princess Diana also changed the country's mood. While it may seem too convenient to link these events directly, one observer recalled a clear shift in atmosphere, adding, Be Here Now missed its moment. It arrived when the mid-90s spirit was already fading into something else. In contrast, albums that had a more reflective tone like Radiohead's OK Computer or The Verve's Urban Hymns resonated more deeply with listeners at the time. By the way, let me know if you guys want me to cover these records. The first single, Do You Know What I Mean, topped the UK charts, as I had previously mentioned, and it also went to number 2 in Sweden and went to number 36 on the mainstream rock tracks chart. It also went to number 1 on the rock charts in Canada. The second single, Stand By Me, was inspired by a bout of food poisoning that Noel was dealing with when he first moved to London. His mother, Peggy, would phone her son to check in on him and repeatedly told him to ensure that he was eating properly. This spurred Noel to cook himself a proper British Sunday dinner, which resulted in him getting food poisoning. The single peaked at number 2 in the UK. It didn't chart in the States. The third single, All Around the World, was actually one of the first songs Noel had ever written, but it wasn't included on the band's earlier releases due to the guitarist wanting an extravagant production. It ended up topping the UK chart and went to number 15 on the US alternative chart. Clocking in at over 9 minutes, it became the longest number 1 single in the UK's chart history. The song Don't Go Away, the fourth and final single, dated back to 1993, and it deals with losing someone close to you. It wasn't issued as a single in the UK, and it ended up charting at number 5 and 36 on the alternative and mainstream rock tracks chart. In the years since, Be Here Now has become this totem for 90s excess. But its most interesting legacy is how it broke the band's own view of their work. The Gallagher brothers, who were never exactly a united front, have completely opposite takes on the album. Liam to this day defends it. He often says it's his favorite Oasis record, or at least one of them. For him, the sound was the point. He loves the raw power, the unapologetic arrogance, the sheer volume of it all. And to him, it's a punk rock record, just a blast of pure energy. Noel, on the other hand, loathes it with a passion, and that's something that seems to only get stronger with time. His quotes about the album are legendary for their savagery. He said the tracks are too long and there's too much going on. And of course, there's his famous summary, the sound of a bunch of guys on coke in the studio, not giving a f***.
Now, the thing about Be Here Now is, I'd say the lesson I learned from it is when you shouldn't be making a record, don't make a record. We should have let Morning Glory land after Knebworth, and that American tour that came just after Knebworth that ended in a disaster and ruined us effectively in America. Instead of coming back to England and all going our separate ways, we decided to go into the studio with a load of songs that weren't good enough for the first 2 records. And we're trying to make it sound important with strings and all that kind of thing. I don't like it as a record, but I loved it at the time. But it's when we got out on tour, and this is what I mean about letting Morning Glory land and kind of, you know, do its thing and let the ripples of that just fade away. It was still a massive record when we went out with Be Here Now. And all the gigs we were doing, most of the people at the gigs had still never seen us. So they'd never seen us do Morning Glory. Far less, definitely maybe. So you'd get all these really energetic punk pop songs of Definitely Maybe. And then all these iconic songs of Morning Glory. And then these songs of Be Here Now where people would go, be over in 7.5 minutes, this one. What can I tell you? Instantly, to me, was like, oh, these songs are not working. And no matter what we did on that tour, we could never make it work. We started off doing too many, and then we weren't doing enough of them. And this is a massive but, as much as I don't like that period musically, that was the best time I think Oasis ever had out on the road. It was f***ing amazing.
Now, this all came to a head in 2016 with the Chasing the Sun reissue of the album. Noel actually tried to remix the entire record to go back and fix it, as he put it. He wanted to strip away all the layers of noise and just let the songs breathe, but he gave up in frustration after only finishing a rethink of the first track, Do You Know What I Mean? He admitted he couldn't keep going, basically admitting that the album's problems were baked right into its DNA. The wall of sound he had so proudly built in 1997 had become a prison that he couldn't escape. So why does Noel hate their most explosive album? Because Be Here Now isn't a monument to their success, it's a monument to their arrogance. It's the sound of a band that achieved every single dream they ever had and then had absolutely no idea what to do next. They had unlimited money, unlimited studio time, and an unlimited supply of drugs, a combination that turned out to be creatively toxic. The creativity that came in the early part of their lives from living in poverty was no longer a thing for them. The album that was supposed to cement their legacy as the next Beatles instead became a cautionary tale. It captured the exact moment that the optimism of Britpop curdled into self-indulgent parody. It's a record that's somehow both overproduced and weirdly raw because it captured with perfect, unflattering honesty exactly what the band had become: loud, arrogant, insecure, and completely out of control. But some people love that. It may not be their best album, but for better or worse, it's their most honest. It's a sonic snapshot of 5 working class guys who conquered the world and then promptly lost their plot in a blizzard of fame and cocaine. And while Liam may love it for the chaos it represents, Noel will probably always hate it for the very same reason. It's the sound of a golden opportunity completely wasted. James Corcoran of the Oasis podcast perfectly summarized this time, admitting, "My team had won the championship. The next year, it was never going to be the same, because once you've got over the hill, that's closing credits." What's your take on Be Here Now? Is it a bloated mess or a misunderstood masterpiece? Let me know down in the comment section below, guys. Thanks for watching today's video. And as always, if you have suggestions for future topics, let me know in the comment section below, and we'll see you again in Rock and Roll Your Stories. Take care.